I'm Kathy Hoke. I am the director of the Network for Public Health Law's Eastern Region, as well as a professor of law here at the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law. So welcome, and thank you again for coming. I will say, when we had a flurry of folks over the course of the last 2 days, fearful of what was, not good weather here in Baltimore, we were fearful. But I look out and I see plenty of friendly faces and folks seemingly happy to come and talk about public health law today. So again, thank you for making it out in what ends up being a beautiful day out there. A couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, because I know what everyone wants to know is, how do I connect? So there are some papers in the back of the room that have this on there if you need to grab it, but I'll tell you to connect to the Wi-Fi. It is called UM Conference, or UMCONF is the Wi-Fi that you're looking for. The username is Law Connect, LAWCONNECT, and the password is capital L, LAW, hyphen 2018. So capital L Law hyphen 2018. Again, there's forms in the back should you forget. So there you go. So you're not using up your data. You can have that. And I am really pleased to introduce you to Dr. Josh Sharfstein. I know many of you actually know Dr. Sharfstein, but to introduce a speaker is one thing, to introduce a colleague is one thing, but to introduce a colleague who's also a friend is really a pleasant experience for me. So I could read to you about Dr. Sharfstein, but I probably don't even need to. What's most important to know about him is he is on the advisory board of the Network for Public Health Law, an inaugural member of the board, and really an incredible contributor to our mission in providing technical legal assistance to state and local public health officials, legislators, folks from all disciplines, transportation, environment, et cetera, across the country. And so we really value the contributions that he's made. I know Dr. Sharfstein initially as my client. So he has had quite a few jobs that called upon my services as an attorney. So first in his capacity as the health commissioner for Baltimore City during we did some really interesting and innovative work there, particularly with cigar regulation that unfortunately the Maryland Court of Appeals struck down. So we're still untangling the impact of that, but it has brought to light some opportunities for us in local public health law. And then as the secretary for the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, which is now the Maryland Department of Health, and as the deputy commissioner, the principal deputy commissioner for the Food and Drug Administration. So you can see he's a slacker, really hasn't accomplished much in his life. But now Dr. Sharfstein is enjoying the academic freedom that comes with being on faculty. He's the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice and Training at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is the director of the Bloomberg American Health Initiative, which is, like it sounds, funded by the Bloomberg to provide support to public health practice. And it is a dynamic, I think just started in 2016, so I'm sure still kind of figuring out all of the, how to execute the mission, set out by the grant. But I know Dr. Sharfstein is the one person who can get from point A to point B and then hustle you over to point C before you realize you were done point B. So I'm grateful for him coming here today, again, as a colleague, as a friend, and I turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. You didn't mention that I think it's the wrong decade. I got the timing up on my slide. Yeah, other than that.
And after I joked about it, I didn't do the one thing I should have done, and that is Dr. Sharfstein also published a book last year that's really, I'm not lying, it's an interesting read. I had it on my nightstand until my husband was like, no, could you read something else at night? But it's the Public Health Crisis Survival Guide, available on Amazon. Easy, quick read, but really great. But yeah, that's amazing.
Okay.
2009. Where would we be? My hair would not look like this.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Kathy. And Kathy really epitomizes just such a smart person and an amazing lawyer to help solve all kinds of problems. So I just want to, that just being here at the law school reminds me when I was a medical student. I'm a pediatrician. I called my father, and I remember this conversation, and I said, Dad, I could also go to law school. Right? I could just leave medical school, then go back, and then I'd be a doctor and a lawyer, And just think about it, because law is so important to health, and I'm going to be a doctor, and I could bring both of those things together, and it would be amazing the kinds of things I could do in my career. And I'll never forget what he said to me, which was no. So I want to fast forward to being the health commissioner, and on my first day I met the city solicitor, Ralph Tyler, and he said to me, Josh, I don't want you to be running off doing things without, support from the solicitor's office. We are your lawyers. We're here for you. Never, never hesitate to call us. We can help you accomplish things. We can make sure you don't get into trouble. We can do all these, things to make the health department successful in improving the health of Baltimore. And I said, I totally appreciate that. I am not going to hesitate to call. Just like you said, I appreciate such a warm offer. And 2 weeks later, Ralph called me back and said, you do know that our lawyers have families. So in my whole public career, I have been a very intensive user of legal services. And I thought that from my perspective, just to kind of get a great day going, I would just give you a little bit of my sense of why I think public health law and public and health law is so important, particularly right now. And so here are my 5 things: to defend sensible policy, to stop harmful policies, to address novel regulatory challenges, to fight the opioid epidemic, to recognize opportunities for progress. I could keep going, but I will finish by the time allotted with just these 5. So to defend sensible policies didn't take me very long to find a few headlines of things that are out there. We have challenges to the soda tax in Philadelphia on the grounds that it's double taxation. We have challenges to the Medicaid expansion in Idaho. That's from last week, where somebody was arguing that because the referendum referenced federal law, it was illegal. We, of course, have the big case for the Affordable Care Act. There's pretty much nothing of significance in public health these days that doesn't get challenged one way or another. And the alliance between lawyers and the public health community in doing these things is incredibly important. And this is at every level. And I'll just tell you, even at the micro level, it's extremely important. When I was health secretary in the state of Maryland, we changed the way that care coordination happens for kids with very severe illness and disability in Maryland. And doing that required moving from 4 care coordination agencies to 1. That may seem, pretty minor, but it turned into just an enormous fight because the 4 care coordination agencies did not want to lose their contracts. We wanted to create much more of a system that would work for the families and particularly the clinicians who needed the care coordination for these kids who are severely disabled in many cases. And we wound up designing a procurement approach that didn't have the companies bidding against each other on the basis of price, but on the basis of how they would organize their services to better serve kids. And we wound up getting challenged in multiple courts. We wound up in all kinds of fights, and at one point, our chief lawyer, who was named Josh Auerbach, he went before the state board of procurement, where they were sort of asking tough questions from some of the contractors who were going to lose their contracts, and he looked at them and said, and they said something like, I don't understand why you don't just keep funding the 4 companies that have been doing it for so long, and he looked at them and said, I'll tell you why. There's an attitude that once you get a contract from the state of Maryland, I'm paraphrasing, you will always get that contract. But there's no way it'll ever go out. And that attitude isn't just terrible for morale in the health department, and other agencies, that you can never make things better. It's terrible policy for the people that we're supposed to serve. And it ends right here. And it was like, oh my, I got like 40 emails from people like, who is your lawyer? Because that was just such an amazing thing, and we succeeded in all those court cases, and we're able to improve that policy. Number 2, to stop harmful policies. This is a big one these days. We have all kinds of proposals that, I did take one law course. I snuck over in my fellowship and took administrative law at Boston University as an auditor, in addition to my health law classes. That was a course taught by a very, very conservative law professor, but he did a great job, and I learned an enormous amount. It helped me in all the different things that I did later on. And even I, with my dangerously weak knowledge of administrative law, recognize that there's some serious weaknesses with how some of the proposals that are coming out of the administration that really have enormous implications there's some weaknesses in how they've gone forward, and it's just extremely important to be thinking about how to stop things that really make no sense. In Baltimore, some of you may know, others may not, that basically on an administrative law type of challenge, the health commissioner got $5 million in funding back for teen pregnancy prevention programs that had been struck out by the administration. There's also obviously a lot of litigation on immigration. We had some legal help from some public health lawyers in filing a number of clinicians and public health people at Johns Hopkins a challenge to the public charge rule, which is just a very confused regulation. It was written by the Department of Homeland Security without seemingly any understanding of the Medicaid program and how it works and other major important things. And really, these things have just enormous implications. And we're talking to lawyers a lot on how to think about challenging them. The Title X litigation is extraordinarily important for access to health care for women, particularly all across the country. And then there are addressing novel regulatory challenges. Just a quick note, this is not me eating a Tide Pod. Some people might look at that and wonder whether that might be me. But I've always found, great lawyers absolutely essential when something new is coming around. And a good example of that was Four Loko. How many people here remember Four Loko? So Four Loko combined all of the alcohol of 4 beers with all of the caffeine of 5 Diet Pepsis and all of the sugar of a few Krispy Kremes in one can. And the kids would go to parties and be given 2 cans and told they had to drink both before they could sit down. And there were all kinds of problems. And I was at the Food and Drug Administration at the time, and we had a big challenge trying to figure out what to do. And we actually we got a call from a state attorney general who was very concerned about this, and we asked them to write a letter of concern and to work with public health professors, and we got all these concerns in. And then we had a lot of resistance within even FDA of what to do. People said, well, caffeine is a food additive, but we're in the midst of this 5-year long-term, big complicated study of caffeine, and we really should wait for that. In the meantime, kids were getting assaulted, there were car accidents, alcohol poisonings, other things, and I didn't feel like that was fast enough. I actually had a relatively junior lawyer working with me who was fantastic, and we work with the solicitors, the chief counsel's office at FDA to think about initially writing letters to the companies asking for their justification that caffeine was a safe food additive, and then moving towards a warning letter. And I remember we had a release of a warning letter. We had arranged it so that it was FDA, CDC saying these products were unsafe, the FTC, which was taking action on the advertising, and 2 state attorney generals at the press conference, one from a Republican attorney general, I think from Iowa, and one a Democrat. And we also had a guy who looked like he was from Central Casting, for a career government bureaucrat, from the Trade and Tax Bureau, which was formerly ATF. And the lawyers at FDA pulled me aside and said, Josh, I know you want to say that you're banning these. You cannot. You're writing a warning letter. You're giving them 15 days to respond. Then we're going to have to analyze it. We can't say how long it's going to take us. We don't know what they're going to tell us in those 15 days. So if you so much as say you're banning it, we're going to leap across and hit off on the conference call. And we had like 700 reporters on the line. That's what it's like at FDA. It's just crazy when you're going to make an announcement people want to know. So, I spoke and I said we were doing the warning letter, and we went around, and the attorney generals were talking about all the problems that they saw. And then this guy who was, maybe 5'2" in this, slightly too big suit, kind of came up from, and he said, under our law, we can halt the interstate sale of, I'm again paraphrasing, of alcoholic beverages if there's a significant health problem, but we're going to take the warning letter as indication of that. So you can't sell these anymore, as of, tomorrow or something like that. And so they did come off the market, and I just winked at the FDA attorneys. But that whole strategy was designed by the lawyer that I work with, who had worked really closely with the lawyers at that agency, and we were able to move forward. And those came off the market. I'm sort of at the age right now, I've gone through the age where my students in the public health school were kind of aggravated that I was the one getting Four Loko off the market, into the age where people kind of knew about it from their big brothers and big sisters. So other things that are going on these days, you may know about direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical sales. This is a couple things I found on the internet. Shop hair, shop sex, shop skin, shop vitals. This is you go on and you push a button, you're connected maybe to someone for a questionnaire, you can get Viagra or Rogaine or whatever medicines. People are buying these things, considerably. There are a whole bunch of startups. Some startups are actually reformulating the generic drugs themselves. One of them are taking beta blockers and trying to make it like a mint. So like, before that big date, take a beta blocker for the anxiety, and then you can just order it online. That's a relatively new phenomenon. You have challenges like people eating Tide Pods for some reason, and then you have things like, Juul, which came on the market, and very, very quickly was being used by an enormous number of young people. And so all of these are new challenges. And when they're new challenges, it's a combination of seeing what authority you have and what regulatory structure you need. And just as an example, I've been thinking about these new pharmaceutical challenges and the ability for people to order online very quickly. And I think what's interesting is they've typically they raise two types of questions for regulation today, and I think a third question for whether there needs to be a new structure. The regulations today is, can these companies, are they bound by the federal guidelines on fair and balanced, basically, communications? Is it like a pharmaceutical company selling Viagra when they say like, hey, you can get Viagra, or are they just allowed to say whatever they want about Viagra? Are they held to a different standard? Or do they have to be balanced between risks and benefits and say, certain people shouldn't use it and stuff like that? So that's one active question. The other question, of course, comes up is the doctor-patient relationship. Is it enough to get a questionnaire, and have some doctor somewhere writing the prescription? Do you have to do face-to-face? Do you need an exam somewhere when they ask for your blood pressure? Do you have to type in your blood pressure, or do you have to go somewhere to get a blood? So there are all those questions. But I think fundamentally, in this case, what we're dealing with is a new kind of entity. And maybe that entity itself has to be regulated rather than just using regulation on the parts of that entity that are touching traditional systems. And this came up occasionally in Maryland. Like, for example, we had a death and some very severe illnesses in a surgery center, or like a cosmetic surgery center. And of course there was regulation of the physician. The physician could lose their license. You can always sue after the fact. But when you see problem in these cosmetic surgery centers, maybe they need a license, and maybe you need to regulate them separately as different entities. We actually did surgical abortion facilities like that in Maryland, and we actually took action against one that had a pattern of really substandard care that the other facilities complained about. And so if you see a problem or a new kind of thing emerging, figuring out the right way to regulate that directly is sometimes better than just trying to regulate around the edges. As an example, if you have a doctor who gets into trouble with Viagra prescriptions, the company might be able to find another doctor. The problem is, perhaps the model that they're using or the way that they're approaching it. Third, the opioid epidemic. I think that the legal strategies here are just beginning to play out and could play a really important role. Obviously, on tobacco, the legal strategies had an enormous impact at so many different levels, from regulation to lawsuits. Here are just a few examples. A big one, obviously, are the lawsuits that are coming, and how that is handled is going to be extremely important. A number of us have been involved in lawsuits at different levels. As consultants or experts, then there is also, I think, an emerging recognition of how poorly the criminal justice system has handled the issue of addiction in many different ways. One example of that is the fact that people get arrested, and if they are they have an addiction, they're basically weaned right off or stopped cold turkey. And one of the major impacts of that is that it increases their risk for overdose, because they're not getting any real treatment. And so they're craving opioids, and when they go right back out, they've lost their tolerance and they can die. And the evidence is for people who are leaving detention, in that they have 100 times greater risk of overdose death than the general public, 10 times greater overdose risk than the risk that they'll have in 6 months. And at the same time, if you were to treat those people, you'd drop the overdose risk. And we worked, for example, in Rhode Island, where they decided they would treat every single person, offer treatment to everyone who qualified in the jail and prison, which are on the same site in Rhode Island, and had a 60% drop in overdose mortality among people leaving detention. And that is not an unusual result based on the literature. So we've been working, and there are many other, the ACLU is really the lead agency. We have gotten some great pro bono help to really work on the legal right to medications for treatment in the detention system. It is really a life or death issue. We filed an amicus brief in the Massachusetts case that just happened. The jail was ordered to provide a methadone treatment. The other major area here has to do with access to services. And I've been doing a lot on the opioid epidemic lately, and my one sentence on the challenge of the opioid epidemic is that in the United States, we want to do the things that don't work and we don't want to do the things that work. And so there are a number of reasons for that, but some of the things that work, people really get upset about, including treatment and syringe exchange and harm reduction, and it's actually public health law and public health coming together for strong standards for those things, but also standing up for the rights of people. And some of these are lawsuits about accessing treatment programs, accessing harm reduction, that are going to be really important to saving lives in the opioid epidemic. And then there's recognizing opportunities for progress. So there's nothing better than puzzling over something and having a lawyer find a provision of law that can really be a clear path for doing something great. And so not all of what is necessary is a good defense. It's also really figuring out what opportunities there are. And that's why I think public health and the law are such a really great, combination when they come together. It's just extremely powerful. It's why I'm a super user of legal services in every job that I've been in, because there's just amazing things that can be done. And if it's law alone, sometimes it comes across as a little heavy-handed. If it's public health alone, you can't get it done. You bring those together, you have good public health practice, you think things through, you do the kind of community engagement that's necessary to develop genuine understanding of things, and you can really accomplish a lot of things. And one previous example, you see a picture of what is known as a baby bumper pad. So turns out that baby bumper pads, they don't really have any benefit to the baby. The babies can't get their heads through the slats anyway. I think the last time the slats were allowed to be made that a baby's head could fit through them was 1970 something. And so we're well past that, but you do see babies getting smushed up against the bumpers, choked by the bumper pads, and there's also an argument that when the bumper pads don't allow air to pass through, it actually increases the risk for sudden infant death. And there's evidence, for example, that fans in the nursery reduce the risk of sudden infant death. And so our medical examiner really felt like air circulation was extremely important. And we had deaths from a bumper pad in Maryland, at least one. And so we set out to ban, or at least to decide what to do on bumper pads. And one of our lawyers, Josh, looked and said, well, there's a provision of law in Maryland that says that the health secretary shall basically ban items that pose an unacceptable risk to kids. Now, we could have just up and done it, just announced that we were doing it, and people would have said, what in the world are you doing? We had, instead, we convened an advisory committee of experts. We brought in testimony. The companies that make the baby bumper pad industry called and said, hey, we didn't think your public comment period was fair because we didn't have a chance to have an oral presentation. So we bravely gave them an hour oral presentation. Our expert panel still voted to ban them. And then we did more public comment. And by the time we actually did it, we went from something that would have maybe confused people to actually actually getting it done. We had one hearing where the industry had hired lobbyists to try to stop us, and I was sitting next to the other Josh at the hearing, and they said, you know, the most effective argument to the Maryland General Assembly against us trying to do this, after we had the medical examiner, we had examples of deaths, we had all the evidence, we'd done 3 public comment periods, 2 or 3, the best argument against the health department doing it was, you're a member of the legislature. You don't want the health commissioner doing this. You should be doing it. If anyone should, it should be you. So it wasn't on the merits at all. It was just about, you know, should it be done by legislation? Because, and so that, you know, they took people who would say, like, I'm sure these bumper pads are terrible, Dr. Sharfstein, but like, you're trying to usurp the appropriate authority of the General Assembly here. That was the argument. And it was a very close vote. And Josh, my lawyer sitting next to me, leaned in and he said, you know, I said something like, well, you know, I just want to make sure that you understand the legal advice I'm getting on that question. And he said, there is a law that you passed that says the health commissioner shall take action against, you know, things that pose an unacceptable risk. And through this process, he has made that determination. He has no discretion once he's made that determination. It is the law that you all passed. And so it is an obligation. Is basically the way I've told him, once he's reached that determination, which he has through this extensive public process. And in the end, you know, we won. I will say that I was telling someone for the Congressional Oversight Committee earlier on in my career, and so I did get one question to one of the members of the panel for the baby bumper pad industry. And the question was, somewhat embarrassed to tell you, was you've heard the testimony from the medical examiner, I'm again paraphrasing, that the babies can suffocate if they get too close to the bumper pad in their head. You know, when a baby gets too close, what would your advice to the baby be? And the person said, I would advise the baby to back away from the bumper pad. So in the end, we won that vote and they came off the market. The other, you know, really important area, I think, of tremendous opportunity is related to the appropriate use of healthcare data for public health. And, you know, we have a situation in public health where we are often the last one to know about things. We have the gold standard surveillance systems, but it takes quite a while to really understand what's happening. And almost everything, you know, we hear about if there's some problem because an ER doctor saw it or, you know, that somebody, a community organization noticed it. And, you know, we often don't have really good data to understand what that's about. And yet, increasingly, there are these very sophisticated data sources that would allow, for example, understanding of which apartment buildings in Baltimore or any other city are really responsible for enormous amounts of asthma and really require remediation, or other things that could be known on a much more rapid and specific timetable. And understanding how to do that appropriately is also about law and public health coming together, really identifying issues that are of concern to communities, working with them, and coming up with a strategy that people can understand, taking public comment, and then basically using the authority that is granted by a provision of HIPAA, not an exception to HIPAA, but a provision of HIPAA, that healthcare data can be used for public health, creates, you know, tremendous opportunities. And this is a report that I worked on with some people in the Network for Public Health Law, called Using Electronic Health Data for Community Health, which is focused on asthma and all the different things that could happen there. And recently, you know, one of the projects that I work on is working with lawyers to try to help people implement things like this, because I think it will really help public health. I think public health is unfortunately a little bit trapped into the paradigm of let's implement evidence-based programs. And the problem with that is the evidence-based programs have been proven in a research context somewhere, it might be completely different. And even if you were to implement it perfectly, it might not work, but people don't always implement it perfectly. It's extremely important to get feedback and know whether what you're doing is working, like anything, you know. And I usually would say, like, why don't we go, if I'm talking to doctors, I would say, imagine doing a campaign against central line infections in the ICU, and I'm gonna tell you in 2 years what the central line infection rate was for the entire city. You know, it's very hard to know whether it works. When they do those campaigns, they're looking at every single ICU infection, and they're trying to figure out how they can prevent it if what they're doing is actually working or not. So since I'm here, I would just say thank you to all of the tremendous lawyers that I've had a chance to work with in many different jobs. I think almost every single thing that I've done has been not only with great public health staff, but with lawyers right there. And that includes the things I've talked about and a whole bunch of other things. So I think the topics you have for your day today are great, and I just wanted to maybe just use this opportunity to express my appreciation. I think that there are all these really interesting issues, and we need more people defending us, and we need more people thinking about great opportunities. So thank you very much, and Kathy asked me to save a little time for discussion and questions, so I will stop here. Thank you.
I don't know if it makes me feel experienced or old or what, but I know all of those people up there. I mean,
Yeah.
they're all, I'm one of them, actually, also. But, and I guess, we have a question for Dr. Sharfstein. Yep.
Hello, Dr. Sharfstein. I remember you when you was at the Maryland State leading that. What I want to know is, what is your opinion when you talk about the continuum of care, treatment, recovery, support, and public safety? What do you think? What is your idea of what the role of prevention is, especially when we talk about the opioid crisis?
Sure. So I think that prevention can be thought of at different levels of prevention. So there's sort of the more proximate levels of prevention, which include prescribing. Prescribing has gotten a lot of people in prescribing opioids for pain, for example, has led to a lot of unnecessary addiction. And I think you need smart, nuanced policy, actually, to be able to improve prescribing. I think the FDA can do some things that it hasn't done to help clinical practice. I think state law in some cases can be useful, but I also am a little concerned that some of the policies that are rolling out are a little too aggressive and actually will push people who are actually doing quite well right now on opioids into a crisis of one kind or another. So there's a very interesting set of policies and issues around that kind of prevention. I think that if you kind of go back a level and you say, well, what are the other kinds of policies that relate to prevention? I would say the next level has to do with drugs particularly. And personally, in HIV, we think of treatment as prevention because when people are treated, then their viral load goes to zero. There's an issue there, I think, also for addiction. If people are actively using heroin, that's not a great influence on the people around them. And if that person instead is doing great in treatment and knows how to get other people into treatment, that reverses that cycle. So I don't think of prevention separate from the necessity of setting up access to effective treatment. And then related to that, I think there are policies around drugs that really make things hard, and are such as some of the criminal justice policies, just not only about access to treatment, but also about who gets arrested and what happens to their criminal record and how that may prohibit them from getting housing or jobs. All that is also prevention. Then you can go a step back even further and say, what about keeping young people sort of on a trajectory where they're not going to be using drugs? And I think there has a lot to do with their ability to succeed. When we looked at the evidence when I was Baltimore City Health Commissioner, at the vast majority of kids who are using drugs have had trouble in school first. The trouble in school precedes the drugs. There are some kids that are just straight A students and then they get into drugs and then boom. But it's much more likely that they have been really failed by the school system, they haven't been going to school, and then they drop out or they're half dropped out, and then they get into drugs one way or another, maybe initially by selling and eventually by using. And it's really fixing some of those other systems and supports that are the most important things. So we wound up taking rather than like a say no to drugs educational thing, which I'm somewhat skeptical of as a major investment, we tried to support more attention to kids who were at risk for particularly attendance and other problems in 6th and 7th and 8th grade as like an investment for prevention. But I think there are a lot of opportunities in that area, and there's some evidence also around different community-based prevention and education efforts. So I think there's a range of different things. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Great, thank you so much. This was really interesting. What do you do when the law gets ahead of the public health research and data? So I guess something I'm thinking about is legalization of cannabis. And in many cases, states are pushing that forward when we don't necessarily have all the public health research. Like generally the two, public health law and research, should work together. But what happens when the law gets too far ahead?
Sure. I mean, I don't think of those as public health laws at all, really, And, my position was always that there really isn't great evidence on the use for health purposes, and that if we wanted to think about it, it'd be better to think of it as more of an investigational use and regulate that accordingly, and that there were major risks to full legalization that needed to be considered as part of any kind of effort. That was my position. My brother, who is a law professor, called me after one of the hearings at Annapolis and said, I remember vividly that I was ruining the family name on Twitter. So that's not always the most popular position. I was at one hearing where people said, there are all these people here. This person says it cured his gout. This person said it cured, and how do you respond to that? And I said, well, when I was at the FDA, we had a name for the day when people said, without, really legitimate evidence that something cured their condition, and that was called Monday, also Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. I mean, that is the nature of regulation of drugs. So I think it's a really important issue, and I think there's going to be a huge opening for smart public health law and regulation that's going to come in at different levels in these states. But right now, I wouldn't call it public health, legislation too much. It's very rare that it's really supported by public health. It's sort of happening because of a different kind of push. I do think, though, that I thought you were going in a slightly different direction, which is I think the law is getting ahead of public health in some very important ways, and circling back to undermine, the biggest one would be the law on the First Amendment. And I think that poses this enormous threat. I was invited up to Yale Law School to give a talk where there was this whole First Amendment in the law thing, and I basically got up and said, you gave like a million examples and said, your First Amendment direction is undermining the health of people. People are dying. I gave examples like Thompson versus Western States, which was a case at the Supreme Court about advertising of compounded drugs. You can draw a direct line between that case and the New England Compounding Center outbreak, because they were advertising like crazy because the Thompson case allowed them to do that. And I said, that is what's going to happen. You can't pretend that it doesn't have these consequences, and judges can't sit around and just assume they're public health experts. I understand there is a First Amendment, but to move it all the way in this direction is going to cost lives. And the dean of Yale Law School came up to me afterwards, and it was a very vigorous debate. I got in some debate with some blogger, and I felt pretty good about it at the end. And the dean of Yale Law School told me he was very disappointed in the talk. And I said, really, why? And he said, because you didn't give us the legal answer for how to sort of thread the needle. And I'm like, my dad didn't let me go to law school. I don't have the legal answer for you. That's why there are all these lawyers. I can tell you this is a problem. I can't tell you how to write about the First Amendment in a way that is going to convince people to back away from the edge of basically obliterating product regulation and all these other things that are extremely important to public health.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
I will add on the First Amendment issue, my colleague Micah Berman, who's at Ohio State School of Law and School of Public Health, he writes in this field of the intersection of First Amendment jurisprudence and public health, and every time he writes an article, it's outdated by the time it's published because something else bad has happened as a result, and we see soda warning labels again in the news for being struck down. So the First Amendment and public health is a great way to end this because it's never going to end, the intricacies of the two of them. So again, thank you for coming, thank you for being here, and for explaining to folks kind of why the lawyers are as important at the table as other folks, and you've used us quite well. So we'll start getting set up for the next panel, and again, just thank you for coming. All right.